My name is Andrea Campbell, and I'm 38 years old. Last week, at my parents' 45th anniversary party, I said a true thing out loud, gently, at a table of relatives, that my mother had spent my whole life loving my brother more than me. And my mother put her face in her hands and sobbed. After everything I've done, she wept, loud enough for every table to hear. After everything I sacrificed for this family, how dare you call me a bad mother? How dare you, Andrea, at our anniversary? And the whole room turned to look at me. 28 relatives and every single face said the same thing. What is wrong with you? What an ungrateful daughter. Look what you're doing to your mother on her special day. I didn't raise my voice. I have never been able to win by raising my voice. Raising my voice just proves I'm the difficult one, the dramatic one, the daughter who was always a little too much, so I didn't. I just slid one page across their table, a single sheet of paper, old and soft at the folds, and at the top of it, in faded blue ink, my own name, Andrea, circled in my mother's handwriting. Her tissue stopped halfway to her eyes. It just froze there, in the air, an inch from her cheek, because she knew that handwriting. It was hers, and she knew the second she saw it exactly what that page was, and that I had finally read it. Before I go any further, if you've ever been the less loved child, the one who was told the favoritism was all in your head, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need it. And drop your city and the time where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel at night. I'm Andrea. This is the story of a daughter who spent 38 years wondering if she'd imagined it, and the one page in her mother's own hand that proved she never had. To understand that page, you have to understand what it's like to grow up certain you're loved less, and to be told every single day that you're imagining it. There were two of us, my brother Trent, 3 years older, and me. And from the very beginning, from before I have memories, from the stories the family tells, Trent was the son the house revolved around. He was the first child, the boy, the golden one. My mother lit up when he walked into a room in a way she simply never did for me. It wasn't subtle, but it was deniable, which is a different thing, and the difference is the whole story of my life. Let me explain what I mean by deniable. If my mother had openly said, "I love your brother more," at least I'd have had something solid to hold. A clean wound heals. But that's not how it worked. What I got instead was 1,000 small things, each one of which, taken alone, could be explained away. Trent's drawings went on the refrigerator. Mine went in a drawer, but the fridge was full, honey. Trent's school play got the whole family in the front row with a video camera. Mine got, "We'll try to make the next one. Trent has a thing." Trent's bad moods were, "He's under a lot of pressure." My bad moods were, "Andrea's being difficult again." Each one, alone, was nothing. You couldn't point to any single one and say that's favoritism without sounding petty, without sounding exactly like the jealous, difficult, too much daughter they said I was. It was only the pattern, the 10,000 small things stacked up over a childhood that told the truth. And patterns are invisible to everyone except the person being crushed under them. Let me give you one, so you can feel the shape of it. When I was 9, I spent 3 weeks on a drawing for my mother's birthday, a careful pencil portrait of her, the kind of thing a 9-year-old pours her whole heart into, erasing and redoing the eyes a dozen times, because I wanted them to look like her real eyes. I gave it to her at her birthday dinner. She said, "Oh, how sweet," set it aside on the counter, and spent the next 20 minutes showing everyone the new golf clubs Trent had picked out for her with Dad's money. The drawing stayed on the counter for a few days, and then it was gone. I found it later in a drawer of takeout menus and dead batteries. Not thrown away, that would have been something I could point to. Just filed under clutter. Trent's golf clubs were a story she told for years. My portrait of her was in the junk drawer by the weekend, and here's what that does to a 9-year-old. I didn't think my mother loves me less. A 9-year-old can't hold that thought. It's too big and too dangerous. Instead, I thought my drawing wasn't good enough. I'm not good enough. I have to try harder. That's the terrible alchemy of the less loved child. You take the evidence that you're loved less, and you turn it into evidence that you're not yet worth loving, which means there's still hope, which means you keep trying. I spent my childhood like that, trying harder, drawing better, being quieter, being easier, being whatever I thought might finally tip the scale. It never tipped. But I didn't know yet that it was a rigged scale. I thought it was me. So I grew up with a strange, corrosive doubt living in the center of me. I could feel every day that I was loved less. And every day when I reached for that feeling, the family told me it wasn't real. Your mother loves you both the same. Don't be ridiculous. Don't be so sensitive. Why do you always have to make everything a competition with your brother? By the time I was a teenager, I genuinely did not know if I was an unloved child or just an ungrateful one. I had no way to tell. The two feel identical from the inside, and everyone I trusted insisted it was the second one. That doubt is the thing I want you to understand before anything else. Because the cruelty wasn't only being loved less, it was being loved less and being told I was crazy for noticing. That second part is what hollows you out. That's the part that took 38 years and 1 page of paper to heal. I became an artist, which I think now was my way of insisting that what I saw was real. When you spend your childhood being told that your own perceptions can't be trusted, that the thing right in front of your eyes isn't there, you do one of two things. You either stop trusting yourself entirely, or you find somewhere to put the seeing where no one can argue with it. I painted. On paper, what I saw was just there. A shadow was where I put it. A color was the color I mixed. No one could lean over my shoulder and tell me the light wasn't falling the way I'd painted it falling, because there it was, on the canvas, undeniable. Art was the one place my eyes were allowed to be right. I think that's why I held on to it so fiercely, even when my mother called it a waste of time. And she did often, while framing and hanging every certificate Trent ever earned. There's a particular cruelty in a child finding the one thing that makes her feel real, and a parent treating it as further proof of her foolishness. But I kept at it, in my room, with the door closed, because the drawings didn't lie to me, and they didn't tell me I was imagining things. A drawing just told me the truth about light and shape, and the truth, even a small truth, about how a shadow falls, was a kind of oxygen in a house full of denial. I teach art now to teenagers at a high school in Asheville, and I will tell you that I can spot the less loved kid in any class within a week. They have a particular way of bracing before they show you their work, a particular flinch when you praise it, like praise is a trick that's about to be taken back. I'm gentle with those kids. I know exactly what they're carrying because I carried it, and because some part of me is still carrying it even now. I tell them their work is good, and I watch them not believe me, and I think, I see you. I was you. Somebody should have told you the truth a long time ago, and I'm sorry it took this long for it to be me. I left home as soon as I could and built a life that was mine. A small house, a good marriage to a steady, kind man named Mark, work I loved. From a distance, I managed the family. Holidays, phone calls, the performance of a normal daughter. And here's the thing I'm not proud of, but have to be honest about. Even into my 30s, even with all that distance, I still wanted my mother to love me. That's the part that doesn't make sense to people who didn't live it. You'd think you'd stop wanting it. You don't. The less loved child spends her whole life as a plant growing toward a window that was painted on the wall. You keep turning toward the light that isn't there, because turning toward light is what growing things do. Every visit home, some buried, stupid, hopeful part of me thought, maybe this is the time she sees me. And every visit, in some small, deniable way, Trent was the sun, and I was the weather. And I'd drive home, telling myself I'd imagined it because that's what I'd been trained to tell myself, and the doubt would settle back over me like dust. If you grew up loved less and told you imagined it, if the gaslighting hurt worse than the favoritism, tell me in the comments. I think there are more of us than the world wants to know. To understand why the whole room turned on me at that party, you have to understand the public version of my mother. In private, my mother's favoritism was a quiet weather system. In public, she was a performance of maternal devotion so complete that no one outside the house ever doubted it for a second. To the relatives, to the neighbors, to her friends, Rosalind Campbell was the mother who'd given everything for her children. She had a whole repertoire, the sacrifices she'd made, the nights she'd stayed up, the things she'd gone without so her kids could have. And the centerpiece of the performance, always, was how much she loved her children equally, how she didn't have favorites, how a mother's heart just expands. She said that one so often it became a family law. A mother doesn't have favorites. She'd say it while heaping attention on Trent and overlooking me at the same dinner, and no one ever caught the contradiction, because the words were so warm and so certain, and she delivered them so well. So by the time I was an adult, the situation was sealed shut. Inside the family, everyone knew their roles. Trent, the beloved, Andrea, the difficult. But the official story, the one told to the wider world, was that Rosalind was a saint who loved both her children boundlessly, and that if Andrea ever seemed unhappy about her place in the family, well, that was just Andrea. Andrea was sensitive. Andrea held grudges. Andrea, between us, had always been a little ungrateful after everything her poor mother did for her. That's the trap I lived inside. If I ever said the true thing out loud, she loves Trent more, I wouldn't just be disbelieved. I'd be confirming the family's whole story about me. The complaint itself would be taken as proof of the ingratitude that supposedly explained the complaint. It's a perfect closed loop. The more I insisted I was loved less, the more I proved I was the ungrateful daughter who could never appreciate a wonderful mother. I learned to stop saying it. For most of my adult life, I simply never said it out loud at all. I swallowed it, the way I'd swallowed it as a child. And I let the official story stand because there was no version of speaking up that didn't end with me as the villain, until a cardboard box in my aunt's spare room changed everything. My Aunt Faye is my mother's younger sister, and she's the one relative who ever looked at me across all those years like she saw something the others didn't. She never said anything outright. That's not how that generation works. And she loved her sister. And you don't accuse your sister of not loving her own child. But there were small things. The way Faye would seek me out at gatherings and ask about me, my painting, my life, real questions, while everyone else was orbiting Trent. The way she'd catch my eye sometimes when my mother did something especially blatant, a flicker of something, apology maybe, or solidarity. I always felt with Aunt Faye very faintly seen. I never knew why she, of all of them, could see me. I found out in October. Faye is in her 60s now, and she was downsizing, selling the big house, moving to a condo, the great sorting through that comes with that. And in the back of a closet, in a box of old letters and photographs she'd kept for decades, she found something she'd forgotten she had. A letter from my mother, written to Faye about 25 years ago, when I was around 13. Faye called me and asked me to come over. She was strange on the phone, hesitant, and when I got there, she had the letter sitting on her kitchen table and her eyes were red. She'd clearly been sitting with it for a while before I arrived. There was a cup of coffee gone cold beside it, and the envelope it had come in, soft and yellowed, set carefully to one side. She made me a cup too, and we sat. And she didn't hand it to me right away. She talked first in the roundabout way of someone working up to something hard. She said, "Andrea, you know I love your mother. She's my sister. We grew up in the same house, and I know things about why she is the way she is that aren't mine to tell, and none of it is an excuse. But I want you to know I'm not doing this to hurt her." She turned her coffee cup in its saucer. "But I have watched you, your whole life, at every holiday, every birthday, looking at your mother like a person standing out in the cold, looking through a window at a warm room. And I have watched you be told over and over that the cold you felt wasn't real. And 2 days ago I found this, and I read it again, and I realized I'd been holding the thing that could tell you the cold was real all along, and saying nothing. I can't do that anymore. I'm sorry I did it as long as I did." And then she told me the thing that explained why she, of all of them, had always been able to see me. She said, "I was the less loved one too, Andrea. In our house, growing up, your mother was the easy one, and I was the difficult one. I know that flinch you have because I have it too. I think that's part of why I could never look away from what was happening to you." And she slid the letter across her kitchen table to me, which is, I realize now, exactly the gesture I would later make at the anniversary party. The truth travels across tables in my family. It always has. We just usually slide the wrong version. I picked it up. It was my mother's handwriting, unmistakable, the careful, slanted cursive I'd seen on 1,000 birthday cards and grocery lists. A letter from my mother to her sister a quarter century ago when she thought no one but Faye would ever read it. And at the top of the page, before the letter even began, my mother had written both her children's names, Trent and Andrea, as if organizing her thoughts. And around my name, Andrea, she had drawn a small, deliberate circle. I didn't understand the circle yet. I understood it when I read what came after. I'm not going to read you the whole letter. Some of it I will never read to anyone because some wounds you don't put fully on display, even to make a point. But I'll tell you what it said because you need to understand what froze my mother's tissue in the air. It was a letter from a younger Rosalind to her sister, the kind of letter you write when you need to confess something to the one person you trust. And what my mother confessed, in her own careful hand 25 years ago, was this: that she did not love her two children the same. That with Trent, love had come easily, naturally, from the first moment. And that with me, she'd written my name and circled it the way you circle the problem on a page. Love had always been work. That I was difficult, that I'd been a difficult baby and a difficult child. That something about me she couldn't name had always kept her at a distance, that she felt guilty about it, that she tried to hide it. But that the truth she could only tell her sister, was that she loved her son in a way she had never managed to love her daughter. And she didn't know how to fix it. And mostly she'd given up trying. The circle around my name. I kept coming back to the circle. She'd circled me like a diagnosis, like the thing that was wrong. Andrea circled the problem child, the one love didn't come easy for, the one she'd quietly filed under difficult and closed the drawer. I'm an art teacher. I've spent my life thinking about marks on paper, about what a line means, about how the smallest gesture of a hand reveals intention. And I could not stop reading that circle. A circle is what you draw around the thing you want to single out. The thing that's different, the answer you got wrong on a test marked by a teacher, the tumor on a scan marked by a doctor. She had looked at her two children's names, written side by side, and her hand had moved, unconsciously or not, to draw a ring around mine, to set me apart, to mark me as the one that needed explaining. 25 years before I ever saw it, my mother's own hand had told the truth her mouth spent my whole life denying. The hand knows things the mouth won't say. I teach my students that. I just never expected to learn it from my own mother's handwriting, on the worst and most freeing page I've ever held. I want to describe to you what it is to read that at 38 years old. It was the worst thing I had ever read. And it was, at the very same instant, the most liberating. Because for 38 years, I had not known, truly not known, whether I was an unloved child or an ungrateful one, whether the coldness I felt was real or whether I was the broken, jealous, too sensitive person they'd always told me I was. I had lived my entire life inside that doubt, and the doubt had done more damage than the favoritism ever could, because the doubt meant I couldn't even trust my own heart. I read it 4 times, sitting at Faye's table. The first time, the words just slid off me, too big to hold. The second time, I started shaking. The third time, I read it slowly, like an art student studying a master's brushwork, taking in every stroke, the way she'd written my brother's name, with an easy fondness, and mine with that small surgical circle. The way her sentences about Trent flowed, and her sentences about me were careful, clinical, the prose of a woman describing a problem rather than a child. The fourth time, I read it and I finally let myself feel the thing underneath all the others, the thing I'd been forbidden to feel my whole life. I was right. And here, in my mother's own handwriting, was the answer. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't been ungrateful. I hadn't been difficult or sensitive or crazy. I had been correct. The thing I'd felt every day of my childhood was real, and my mother had known it was real and had written it down and had spent the next 25 years telling me I was making it up. Faye reached across and held my hand while I read. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just sat with me, the other less loved one, the only person in the family who'd ever stood in the same cold I stood in, and she held my hand while I read the proof that the cold had always been real. I sat in my aunt's kitchen, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Not from the pain of it, or not only, but from the staggering relief of finally being allowed to believe myself. I had the letter for about 6 weeks before the anniversary party, and I want to be honest about those 6 weeks, because they were not simple. My first feeling, after the relief, was that I never wanted to use it. That sounds strange, but understand, for my whole life I'd wanted one thing: for my mother to love me. And some childish, hopeful part of me thought maybe the letter could be a key to that. Maybe if I showed it to her privately, gently, just the two of us, she would finally break down and say, "You're right, I'm sorry, I do love you, I always did. I just didn't know how to show it." The fantasy of the painted window. I was 38, and I was still turning toward light that wasn't there. My husband, Mark, who is wiser than me about my own family because he can see it from outside, talked me through it over a lot of late nights. He never told me what to do, but he asked me one question that cut to the center of it. He said, "Andrea, if you show her privately, what do you think actually happens?" And I made myself answer honestly, and the honest answer was she'd deny it. Even holding her own handwriting, she'd find a way. I was going through a hard time. I didn't mean it. That's not what it says. You're taking it out of context. You've always twisted things. I knew it the way you know the ending of a story you've read 100 times. A private confrontation would just become one more episode of the thing that had hollowed me out my whole life. Me holding the truth, my mother telling me the truth wasn't real, and me walking away doubting myself all over again. She'd had 38 years of practice making me doubt myself. One letter in a private room wouldn't beat that. She'd just absorb it and reframe it, and I'd lose the way I always lost in private. Mark also said something else, quietly, one of those nights that stayed with me. He said, "I've watched you come back from every visit to your parents a little smaller for 10 years. You go in standing up straight, and you come back folded. Whatever you decide to do with that letter, I need you to know that the version of you that doubts herself, that's not the real you. That's the you they built. I married the other one." I hadn't realized until he said it how much I'd let them shrink me. Even as an adult, even with my own home and my own work and my own husband, the doubt had a long reach. It followed me out of that house and into my marriage and my classroom and my own mirror. But there was something the letter could do that nothing else ever had. It could be seen by other people, by the relatives, by the whole audience my mother had performed her sainthood for 45 years. In private, she controlled the story. In public, with the page on the table and her own handwriting visible to everyone, she couldn't. The truth had been made invisible by being kept private my whole life. The only way to make it visible was to bring it into the light, in front of the same audience that had always been shown the lie. I didn't decide lightly. I'm not a vengeful person. I lost sleep over it. There were nights I decided absolutely not, that I'd burn the letter and never speak of it, that being right privately was enough. And there were nights I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that if I didn't do this, I would spend the rest of my life as the footnote, the difficult one, dying someday with the family's false story about me still standing over my grave. But I kept coming back to one thing. I wasn't going to do it to hurt her. I was going to do it so that I would never again be the only person in the room who knew the truth. If you've ever had to choose between protecting a parent's image and finally protecting your own reality, tell me below what you chose. I don't think there's a clean answer, and I want to hear yours. The anniversary party was at a nice restaurant in Asheville, a private room, 45 years of marriage, about 28 people, all the relatives, my mother's friends. Trent, of course, seated at my parents' right hand the way he'd been seated at the center of everything his whole life, and me somewhere down the table where I'd always been. I almost didn't bring the letter. It was in my bag, and 3 times that day I thought about leaving it in the car, leaving it at home, letting the evening just be an evening. I want you to know I didn't walk in there hungry for a scene. I walked in there, even then, half hoping I wouldn't need it, that maybe the night would be kind, that maybe for once I'd feel like a real daughter at my own parents' celebration, and I could let the whole thing go. I'd gotten dressed that morning like a woman dressing for something more serious than a party. Mark watched me put the letter in my bag, take it out, put it back in. He didn't push. At the door, he just squeezed my hand and said, "Whatever happens in there, you already know the truth now. They can't take that back from you tonight, no matter what they do." I held on to that in the car. The whole drive, the letter sitting in my bag on the passenger seat like a small, terrible passenger of its own. When we walked into that private room, the old feeling came over me before I'd even taken my coat off. The particular shrinking I did in any space my mother was performing in. There she was, at the center, radiant, accepting compliments on 45 years. Beautiful in the way she always was in public, warm and gracious and luminous, the mother everyone wished they had. And there was Trent beside her, and there was the empty space at the edge of it all where I was meant to stand. I felt myself folding, the way Mark said I always folded. I got myself a drink I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. That hope lasted about an hour. It happened the way it always happened, except this time I was finally awake to it. My mother stood and gave a little speech, and she talked about her children. And it was all Trent, his accomplishments, his family, how proud she was of the man he'd become. And then, almost as an afterthought, a single sentence about me, something about how I'd always marched to my own drummer, which is the kind of thing you say about a child you've never bothered to understand. And the relatives chuckled fondly, and the moment moved on. And I sat there, 38 years old, experiencing the exact thing I'd experienced at every gathering of my entire life, being the footnote in my own family. I felt the letter in my bag. I felt 25 years of my mother's handwriting sitting 6 inches from my hip. And for the first time, the footnote feeling didn't make me want to shrink. It made me very, very still. And then my Aunt Faye, who knew what was in my bag, who'd given me the letter, caught my eye from across the room. She didn't nod. She just looked at me steadily, and I understood the look. It said, "You don't have to keep being the footnote, not anymore." So later, when the dinner had settled and people were talking in clusters, I said the thing, quietly, to my mother, at her table with a few relatives near enough to hear. I didn't yell, I just said, "Mom, I want to say something true, kindly, on your anniversary. You've loved Trent more than me my whole life. I've always known it, and I'm tired of pretending I haven't." I'd practiced those sentences in the car. I'd wanted them to be calm and clean, not an accusation hurled, just a truth set down. And they came out the way I'd hoped, level and quiet, almost gentle. I wasn't shaking anymore. The strange stillness had taken over. The stillness of a person who has finally stopped hoping for the painted window and is simply telling the truth because it's true. For a half second, something flickered across my mother's face, and I swear it wasn't hurt. Not at first. It was alarm. The quick calculation of a performer who feels the stage shifting under her. She knew, in that flicker, that I'd said the forbidden thing out loud, in front of people, and she reached, fast practiced, for the tool that had never once failed her in 38 years. That's when she started to cry. The lie came first, it always does. And my mother's lie was a masterpiece because she'd been performing it for 45 years. "After everything I've done," she sobbed, and her voice carried, the way it was meant to, pulling every conversation in the room to a stop. "After everything I sacrificed for you, for this family, how dare you? How dare you call me a bad mother? At our anniversary, in front of everyone, I gave you everything. A mother doesn't have favorites, Andrea. I have told you that your whole life. A mother's heart doesn't work that way." She pressed a tissue to her face. "I don't know what I did to make you so bitter. I don't know why you can't just be happy for this family for one night." And the room turned. I felt it turn, the way you feel the temperature drop before a storm. 28 faces swinging toward me, and every one of them holding the story they'd been told for decades. Difficult Andrea, ungrateful Andrea, sensitive Andrea, attacking her saintly mother at a party. My uncle made a small, disgusted sound. A cousin murmured, "Unbelievable." Trent, from his place of honor, said, "Andrea, what is wrong with you? Not tonight. Not to Mom." This was the trap, fully sprung, exactly as it had worked my entire life. I had told the truth, and the telling had been turned instantly into proof of my ingratitude. My mother wept, and the room comforted her, and I was the monster. 38 years, and the machine still ran perfectly. Then they waited for me to do what I had always done, to crumble, to apologize, to say, "You're right, Mom. I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me, and restore the story and take my place back at the bottom of the table as the difficult daughter who'd been put in her place. The old reflex rose in me. I felt it, the lifelong pull to fold, to make peace, to be small enough to be forgiven. But I had a page in my bag now, and it was written in her hand, not mine. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just reached into my bag and I took out the letter and I slid it across the table to my mother. I'm not going to raise my voice, I said. I'm not going to call you a bad mother. I'm just going to ask you to look at that. My mother's hand was still up by her face, the tissue an inch from her eyes, mid-dab, her expression still arranged in the wounded shape she'd been performing. She looked down at the page on the table in front of her, and she saw the handwriting. She didn't read it. She didn't have to. She saw her own careful slanted cursive, 25 years old, but unmistakably hers. And she saw my name circled at the top in her own blue ink, and her tissue stopped. It just froze there, halfway to her face, hanging in the air while every drop of color drained out of her cheeks, because she knew what it was. Of course she knew. You don't forget a letter where you confessed the unforgivable thing. She'd written it to her sister 25 years ago, believing it would stay buried forever. And here it was, on a restaurant table, at her own anniversary party. And her circled diagnosis of her own daughter was sitting in the open, where anyone could lean over and read it. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. The performance was gone. The carrying, wounded voice was gone. What was left was small and fast and frightened. "Andrea, where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter where I got it," I said gently. "What matters is what it says. Do you want to tell them? Or should I?" "That's private," she hissed, and her hand finally came down, the tissue crushed in her fist. You had no right. That was between me and—" She stopped herself before she said Faye's name, but it was too late. And across the room, I saw my aunt sit very still. So I told them, not cruelly. I kept my voice level and quiet, the way you describe a painting, because I wasn't trying to scream the truth. I was trying, finally, to simply show it. "It's a letter my mother wrote to her sister about 25 years ago when I was 13, I said to the table. In it, she writes, in her own handwriting, the handwriting you can all see, that she loved Trent easily, and that loving me was always work, that I was the difficult one, that she'd more or less given up trying." I looked at her. She circled my name at the top, like I was the problem to be solved. I watched it travel around the table. My uncle, who'd made the disgusted sound a minute ago, leaned in and read the top of the page, and I watched his face change, watched the disgust slide off it, and something more complicated arrive. A cousin put her hand over her mouth. The relatives who'd swung toward me in judgment a moment before were now looking at the handwriting, at the circle, at my mother's frozen face, and doing the arithmetic that the page forced on them. That the difficult, ungrateful daughter they'd all been so quick to condemn had just produced in the mother's own hand. The proof that she'd been telling the truth all along. And here is the thing I hadn't fully prepared myself for. It wasn't just my mother's lie on trial at that table, it was theirs too, All of them. Every relative who'd ever patted my hand and told me my mother loved us both the same. Everyone who'd ever said, "Don't be so sensitive, Andrea." They had all, for decades, been unknowing instruments of the gaslighting. And now they had to sit there and watch the proof that they'd helped convince a child she was crazy. Some of them couldn't meet my eyes. Some of them, I think, were rearranging 38 years of memory in real time. Every holiday and birthday suddenly recolored. Again. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My mother's denial came, but it came weak now, because the page was right there, and everyone could see the handwriting. That was a hard time. I didn't mean it the way it sounds. You're taking one letter from 25 years ago and... I'm not taking it out of context, Mom, I said, and I still wasn't raising my voice. And I think the calm was what made it land. You can read the whole thing. I brought the whole thing. There's no context that fixes it. I'm not even angry that you felt it. People can't always help how they feel. I let that sit. What I can't forgive is the 38 years afterward. Because you knew. You wrote it down. You knew it was real. And then you spent my entire life telling me I imagined it. Telling me I was difficult and ungrateful and sensitive for feeling the exact thing you'd already confessed to your sister in ink. You didn't just love me less. You made me think I was crazy for noticing. I said it without heat, which I think frightened her more than shouting would have, because she had no defense ready for calm. She'd spent 38 years prepared for my anger she could reframe as instability, as the difficult daughter making a scene. What she had never once had to face was me, quiet, certain, holding proof, declining to perform the breakdown that would let her win. I spent my childhood, I went on, thinking if I could just be good enough, easy enough, you'd love me the way you love Trent. I thought it was a thing I could earn. I didn't know you'd already decided, before I could even talk, that I was the hard one. I didn't know the scale was rigged. You let me spend 38 years trying to win a game you'd already called, and that was the thing that broke the room open. Not the favoritism, but the gaslighting. Because every person at that table had, at one time or another, helped my mother do it. Every one of them had told me at some point that my mother loved us both the same. They'd all been recruited, unknowingly, into making me doubt myself. And now they were looking at the proof in her hand that they'd been wrong, and that I'd been telling the truth for 38 years. Then my mother lost control. The wounded saint vanished entirely, and what came out was raw and furious, and for the first time in my life, undefended. You want me to say it? Fine, it was harder with you. You were a colicky, screaming, impossible baby and a sullen, watchful child, and you were never, ever easy, the way he was. You looked at me like you were judging me from the time you were 2 years old. And yes, I found it easier to love your brother. Is that what you needed to hear? Are you happy now that I've said it in front of everyone? She stopped. Her own hand flew to her mouth, but it was far, far too late. She'd said it, out loud, in front of all 28 of them. After 45 years of a mother doesn't have favorites, she had just confirmed, screaming every single thing I'd ever been told I imagined. The whole room had heard it. There was no taking it back, no reframing it, no telling me I was sensitive. She had said it herself, with her own mouth, in front of the entire audience she'd performed her sainthood for. And what struck me in that moment was the word she'd reached for: easier. She'd loved Trent because he was easier, as if love were a convenience, a thing you extended to whoever cost you the least, as if a colicky baby, an infant who cried, because that's what distressed infants do, had somehow forfeited her mother's love by being difficult to soothe. She'd decided, before I could even speak in sentences, that I was the hard one, and she'd let that decision harden into a lifetime, and she'd called the whole thing my fault. You looked at me like you were judging me. I was too. I was looking at my mother the way every child looks at the center of their world, and she'd read judgment into it because it was easier to believe her infant daughter was judging her than to ask why she couldn't reach her. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to grief, and underneath the grief, very quiet, something that had been waiting 38 years to arrive. I was right. I was always right. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I was just a child who was loved less and told she'd imagined it. And now, finally, in front of everyone, the truth was standing up in the room where it had always been forbidden. The aftermath was quieter than the party, the way it always is. For a moment, nobody moved. And then it was my Aunt Faye who stood up. Faye, who'd carried that letter and that knowledge for 25 years, who'd given it to me because she couldn't watch me doubt myself anymore. She came around the table, and she stood next to me, physically in front of everyone, and she said, "Roslyn, I kept that letter because part of me always knew this day would come. I love you. You're my sister. But I have watched you tell that girl she was imagining it her whole life, and I couldn't take it to my grave. She deserved to know she wasn't crazy." And she put her arm around me, and for the first time in my life, I felt someone in my family stand on my side of the room. And then Faye said one more thing to the whole table in a voice that shook but didn't stop. "And I'll tell you all something else, since we're finally being honest at this family's table for once. I was the difficult one, growing up. Roslyn was the easy one, and I was the hard one. And our mother made very sure I knew the difference. I spent my whole life thinking something was wrong with me. So when I watched the same thing happen to Andrea, when I watched this family pick a child to be the problem, I knew exactly what it was, because I'd been that child. I should have said it 25 years ago. I'm saying it now. There's nothing wrong with this girl. There never was. The only thing she ever did wrong was notice the truth and refuse to call it a lie." The room was silent. My mother would not look at her sister. And I understood, finally, why Faye had always been able to see me. It takes one to know one. The less loved recognize each other across a crowded room. We always have. Trent didn't know what to do. I'll give him this. The look on his face wasn't smug. It was something more like dawning horror, the slow realization that the throne he'd sat on his whole life had a cost, and that the cost had been me. He hasn't fully reckoned with it, and maybe he never will, but he called me a few days later, which he'd never done in his life. And he said, "I didn't know about the letter. I swear I didn't." And I think I spent my whole life not letting myself see what it was like for you, because it was easier to be the favorite than to notice the price. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was him seeing me, which was new. We talked for almost an hour. That call, longer than we'd talked in years. He told me things I hadn't known, that being the golden child had its own particular prison, that he'd grown up terrified of ever disappointing her, of ever slipping from the pedestal and becoming, in the worst thing our family could imagine, difficult, like his sister, that he'd kept his distance from me partly out of guilt and partly because getting too close to the less loved one felt dangerous, like it might be contagious, like her coldness might rub off on him and cost him his place. It didn't excuse anything, but it was the first honest conversation we'd ever had. Two adults finally comparing the two different prisons of the same childhood. I don't know if we'll ever be close, but we'd never been honest before, and now we had been once. And that's a door that doesn't fully close again. My father said nothing at the party. My father has said nothing my whole life. His great talent is the silence that lets my mother's version stand. But he found me in the parking lot afterward, and this man who never speaks said, "I should have stood up for you a long time ago." I saw it, Andrea. I always saw it. I just didn't have the courage to say it, and I let her tell you that you didn't see what you saw. It doesn't undo a lifetime, but it was the first true thing my father ever gave me, and I took it. He stood there in the cold parking lot for a while after that, an old man who'd spent 45 years choosing peace over his daughter, and he looked like he wanted to say more and didn't have the words for it. Finally, he just said, "Your drawings were always better than his golf trophies." I knew it. I never said it. And then he went back inside to his wife, to the life he'd chosen. I stood in the parking lot and cried, but they were different tears than I'd cried at 13 or 20 or any of the lonely years between. Someone had finally said it out loud. The drawings were better. He'd seen me. He'd seen me the whole time and said nothing. And the saying nothing had cost me 38 years. But he'd seen me, and at 69, in a parking lot, he'd finally found the courage to say so. My mother and I are not in contact right now. I want to be honest that this isn't triumphant, it's just quiet. She sent me a long message a couple of weeks later. Not an apology, but a reframing, an explanation of how hard her life had been, how I'd misunderstood, how that letter was a moment of weakness that didn't represent her real feelings. The same move, the truth in the shape that serves her. I read it once. I didn't answer. I've stopped turning toward the painted window. There was never any light there, and I'm done growing toward it. I've wondered whether she'll ever say a true thing to me. A real apology, not a reframing. I've decided I can't organize my life around waiting for it. For 38 years, I waited for her to love me. And the waiting cost me more than the not being loved ever did. I'm not going to spend the next 38 waiting for her to be sorry. If it comes, I'll receive it. If it doesn't, I've already gotten the thing I actually needed. And it turned out not to be her apology, and not even her love. It was just the truth confirmed in front of witnesses. The simple, life-changing fact that I had not made it up, that I was not crazy, that the cold I'd felt my whole life was real, and the problem was never me. A mother's apology would be nice, but I no longer need it to know who I am. And that, after a lifetime of not knowing, is the freest I have ever been. People ask me if I regret it. doing it at the party in front of everyone on her anniversary instead of letting it go. I've thought about it, honestly. And no, I don't. For 38 years, my mother performed her love for me in public and withheld it in private and made me doubt my own heart in the gap between. The lie had always been public. The truth had always been forced into silence. The only way to make them finally weigh the same was to put the truth just once in the same bright room where the lie had always been allowed to live. I didn't do it for revenge. I keep saying that because it's true and because I need you to understand the difference. I did it because there is a specific, particular damage that comes from being told your whole life that you can't trust what you see. And the only cure for it, the only thing that ever heals it, is to have your reality confirmed in front of the very people who denied it. I didn't need my mother to love me in the end. I'd finally stopped needing that. What I needed was to stop being crazy. And one page, in her own handwriting, with my name circled at the top, gave me that. The strange thing is, what's happened since, inside me. For 38 years, I carried a low, constant hum of self-doubt, a voice that questioned everything I perceived, that asked, before every reaction, "But are you sure? Aren't you overreacting? Isn't this just you being difficult again?" That voice was my mother's, installed so early I'd mistaken it for my own. And since the party, since the truth stood up in that room, the voice has gone quiet. Not all at once, but I notice it now when it speaks, and I can say to it, "No. I checked, I was right. I have the page. I don't have to relitigate my own reality every morning anymore." Do you know what that's like after 38 years? It's like a sound you didn't know was there finally stopping. It's like silence you can rest in. I've gone back to painting more too. For myself, not just for the classroom. There's a looseness in my hand that wasn't there before, like some clenched thing has let go. I think I painted tight for years because part of me was always braced, always defending, always trying to prove my eyes were right. I don't have to prove it anymore. The proof is in a drawer, in my mother's handwriting, and I never have to look at it again to know it's there. I framed a different page after. Not the letter, I'd never hang that. A painting I made that month of a window, a real one, with real light coming through it. I'd spent my whole life growing toward a window painted on a wall, and I painted myself a real one, and I hung it where I'd see it every morning. My students ask about it sometimes. I tell them it's a window. I don't tell them the whole story, but the less loved kids, the ones with the flinch, sometimes I catch them looking at it a beat too long, and I think they understand something about it without being told. Light you make yourself is still light. Sometimes it's the only kind you get. It's enough. My mother circled my name like I was the problem. It turned out, Igu, I was never the problem. I was just the only one in the family telling the truth. The difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who saw too much, which were all just different words for the one who refused to pretend the cold wasn't cold. They called that being difficult. I've come to think it might be the bravest thing I ever did. And the truth, once it's sitting on the table, in your own mother's handwriting, doesn't need anyone's permission to finally be believed.